Welcome to the tutorial for converting fractions, decimals, and percents. In class, we discussed how fractions, decimals, and percents are related. Several students wrote on their papers that fractions, decimals, and percents represent parts of a whole. We also discussed how fractions, decimals, and percents can represent the same value in different ways. Let's look at how each of these can be represented in different forms. Let's start by talking about what the word percent means. So when we are looking at a percent, we are talking about a part of a whole, which in our case, when we are talking about percents are total is out of 100%, and this comes from what the word percent actually means. If you separate, it means per, and the word cent means for 100. Think about a centimeter, a century. So per 100. So this is the way we could write per 100% as a rate. Now let's take a look at how we can change decimals to percents. The first thing we need to think about when we're thinking about writing decimals as percents, we need to think that the place value has to be from the hundreds, because we talked about that this means of 100, per 100. So this is your tens place, so I would need to go one more place value to make the hundreds, and we would add a 0, which would make it 40 out of 100 if we wrote that as a fraction, which is 40%. So another way to think of it is you take the decimal and you multiply it by 100, and when we multiply by 100, we move the decimal 2 places. And now it is at the end, which represents the 40%. Okay, in this next one, you can think of this again as multiplying by 100, which will move our decimal 2 place values, which will give us 325%. And yes, you can have over 100%. So think about that this 3 represents 3 wholes, so it has to be over 100. Because you have 3 wholes and 1 whole is 100%. Then you have 25 of that 100, which gives you the 325%. Now let's write percents to decimals. For example, we have 5%. Well, if we think about that as a fraction, that is 5 out of 100, then you can think about writing it now as a decimal, because this is 5/100ths. So I would have 5/100ths because this is our hundredths place value. So we have 205%. So remember, if it's over 100, that means a whole amount. So I have 2 wholes, and then I can just think of what we did above is 2 5/100ths. Fractions to percents can be solved in 2 different ways, and I'm going to demonstrate both with the problems below. You can either use a proportion to get it out of 100 or divide it to get to a decimal and then change it to a percent. So if I have 2/5, my thoughts should go to, can I get to 100 from 5 as my denominator? Because for percents, it has to be out of 100, and I can, 5 times 20. So I would need to do the same to the top, 2 times 20, which would give me 40, which would be 40%. And then we have 3/8. Once again, I would always start by thinking, can I get to 100 easily? And this one you can't. So I would not do it that way. I would divide it and get a decimal. Remember when we talked about dividing, we have our numerator and our denominator. Our numerator goes on the inside, and our divisor is the one dividing. 8 cannot go into 3, so we need to add a decimal. 8 will go into 30 3 times, which gives me 24. I have 6 left over when I subtract, add that 0. 8 will go into 60 7 times. Subtract 56, you have 4 left over, add 1 more 0, keep going until it either repeats or terminates. 8 will go into 40 5 times exactly. And we have 0 left over. So now I have my decimal, so I can say this is equivalent to this decimal. But remember, we talked about in the last slides that we could multiply by 100, which is the same thing as moving our decimal twice. So this would be 37 and 5/10%. And lastly, we are going to change percents to fractions. Please keep in mind percents are out of 100 and this will be easy. So if I have 16%, that means I have 16 out of the total 100%. And then you can simplify this. You can either divide by 2 or you could divide by 4. So I'm going to divide these both by 4, which will give me 4/25. And this will be in simplest form. Remember, these are equivalent fractions. So next problem, we have 195%. So if you think of it, you have 195 out of 100. So you have at least one whole and 95 out of 100 left over. And some of you may just skip straight to this step, and that's totally fine. But then we need to think, well, I can divide both of these by 5, which will give me 1 and 19/20. Well, that's the end of the video. I have a short quizzes practicing changing percents to decimals, decimals to percents, fractions to decimals, fractions to percent. Just join in, type in your name, and practice away. Let me know if you have any questions.